The morning sun cut through the Pacific haze like molten copper as Lieutenant Commander James "Bulldog" Henderson gripped the control stick of his Grumman Hellcat, his knuckles white against the black leather of his flight gloves. It was June 20th, 1944, and 400 miles west of the Mariana Islands, the largest carrier battle in naval history was about to unfold in the sky above Task Force 58. Through his radio headset, Henderson could hear the urgent voice of his squadron commander, crackling with static and fear. All Hellcat pilots maintain defensive formation around the carriers. Repeat, do not break formation under any circumstances. But as Henderson watched the radar scope painting an impossible picture, 400 Japanese aircraft bearing down on the American fleet like a dark cloud of death, he knew that following orders would mean watching his shipmates die. The mathematics were brutally simple. 72 American fighters against 400 enemy planes meant certain annihilation for the carriers below. Henderson's breath fogged his canopy as he made a decision that would violate every tactical doctrine drilled into him since flight school, a choice that would either save the Pacific Fleet or destroy his career forever. His thumb hovered over the radio transmit button as he prepared to commit an act of insubordination that would echo through naval aviation history. No one aboard the carrier USS Lexington knew that one pilot's defiance that morning would rewrite the rules of air combat and turn the tide of the Pacific War. James Henderson had grown up in the wheat fields of Nebraska, where the horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, and the only thing taller than the grain silos was the water tower that bore his hometown's name in faded blue letters. Cozad, population 2,300. His father ran the local hardware store, selling everything from horseshoe nails to John Deere parts to the farmers who worked the rich soil that fed half of America. Henderson learned to fix engines before he learned to drive them, spending summer afternoons in the dusty garage behind the store, his small hands guided by his father's calloused fingers as they rebuilt carburetors and adjusted timing chains. The boy who would one day command the skies over the Philippine Sea first took to the air in a rusty Piper Cub at the county fair when he was 12 years old, paying 50 cents for a 5-minute ride that changed his life forever. From that moment, Henderson knew that his destiny lay not in the endless fields of Nebraska, but in the boundless sky above them. He enlisted in the Navy 2 days after Pearl Harbor, driven not by hatred, but by a quiet determination to protect the way of life he had known in those peaceful wheat fields. Flight training at Pensacola was brutal for a farm boy who had never seen an ocean. But Henderson possessed something that couldn't be taught in a classroom, an instinctive understanding of how machines worked and how to make them work better. While other cadets struggled with the complex instruments and procedures, Henderson seemed to merge with his aircraft, feeling the engine's vibrations through the seat of his pants and sensing wind patterns through the gentle pressure on his control stick. His instructors noted his unusual ability to improvise solutions when standard procedures failed, a skill that would prove invaluable in the crucible of combat. He graduated third in his class and was assigned to Fighting Squadron 16 aboard the USS Lexington, where his quiet competence and mechanical genius quickly earned him the grudging respect of pilots who had initially dismissed him as just another farm boy who didn't belong in the cockpit of a $1 million fighter plane. The spring of 1944 found the Pacific War at a crucial turning point, with American forces poised to strike at the heart of Japan's defensive perimeter in the Mariana Islands. The capture of Saipan, Guam, and Tinian would provide air bases within bombing range of the Japanese home islands, making this operation a do-or-die moment for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Admiral Soemu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, had concentrated every available carrier and aircraft into Operation A-Go, a massive counterattack designed to destroy the American invasion fleet and preserve Japan's inner defensive ring. The Japanese assembled 9 aircraft carriers and 450 carrier-based aircraft, supported by another 300 land-based planes from Guam and other island bases. Against this armada, Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded Task Force 58, the largest carrier force ever assembled, with 15 aircraft carriers launching 900 aircraft of all types. But numbers alone didn't tell the whole story of the coming battle. Japanese pilot training had deteriorated dramatically since the early days of the war, when experienced aviators like those who had struck Pearl Harbor dominated the skies. Most of the pilots now flying from Japanese carriers had less than 6 months of flight training, compared to the 18 months of intensive preparation required for American naval aviators. The fuel shortage plaguing Japan meant that even this abbreviated training was conducted with minimal flight hours, producing pilots who could barely land on a carrier deck in calm weather, let alone fight in combat. American aircraft technology had also evolved far beyond anything the Japanese could match, with the Grumman Hellcat fighter proving decisively superior to the vaunted Zero that had once ruled the Pacific skies. But perhaps most importantly, American tactical doctrine had been revolutionized by hard-won lessons from 2 years of carrier combat, while Japanese commanders still clung to outdated strategies that had worked in 1941 but were suicidal in 1944. Henderson's squadron had been at sea for 6 weeks when the radar operators aboard Task Force 58 began tracking the massive Japanese strike force approaching from the west on the morning of June 20th. The American carriers had been expecting this attack for days, positioning themselves to intercept Japanese aircraft while they were still far from the vulnerable invasion fleet anchored off Saipan. As the scope readers called out bearing and distance reports, the magnitude of the approaching threat became clear. 400 enemy aircraft in multiple waves, the largest carrier-based attack ever launched against an American fleet. The first wave alone consisted of 169 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, flying in a formation so large it appeared as a solid mass on the radar screens. Henderson felt his stomach tighten as he listened to the reports crackling over the radio. Every pilot in the fleet knew that this was the moment they had been training for since Pearl Harbor, the ultimate test of American naval aviation against the cream of Japanese carrier forces. But as Henderson studied the tactical situation developing around him, he realized that the defensive plan being implemented was fundamentally flawed. Standard doctrine called for fighter aircraft to maintain a protective umbrella around the carriers, intercepting enemy bombers only after they had penetrated close enough to threaten the ships. This conservative approach had worked well against smaller Japanese raids, but against an attack of this magnitude, it would result in catastrophic losses among the carrier fleet. Henderson could see the mathematical reality with crystalline clarity. By the time 400 enemy aircraft reached the defensive perimeter around the carriers, even perfect interception would allow dozens of bombers through to strike the most valuable targets in the Pacific Fleet. The young pilot from Nebraska began to formulate a plan that violated every principle of defensive fighter tactics, a strategy so aggressive and risky that no squadron commander would ever authorize it. He had no idea that his growing conviction would soon force him to choose between following orders and saving lives. The first indication that this would be unlike any previous air battle came when the radio operator aboard the USS Lexington announced that Japanese aircraft were being detected at a range of 150 miles from the task force. Henderson felt his pulse quicken as he realized that the enemy was still more than an hour's flying time away, giving him a window of opportunity that standard defensive tactics would never exploit. Around him, the other pilots of Fighting Squadron 16 were checking their weapons and fuel, preparing for a conventional intercept mission close to the carriers where their protective firepower would be most concentrated, but Henderson's mind was racing through calculations of range, fuel consumption, and tactical geometry that led him to a startling conclusion. If American fighters could intercept the Japanese formations while they were still far from the fleet, the numerical advantage could be neutralized before it became decisive. The key was abandoning the defensive umbrella and launching an aggressive pursuit that would shatter the enemy formations while they were still vulnerable to coordinated attack. Henderson had studied every after-action report from previous carrier battles, and he knew that Japanese pilots were most effective when they could maintain formation discipline and mutual support. Once scattered and forced to fight individually, their inferior training and experience became decisive disadvantages. But attacking at maximum range would require burning fuel that was supposed to be held in reserve for the defensive battle, and it would mean leaving the carriers temporarily unprotected while the fighters pursued targets far from home. Any pilot who advocated such a strategy would be court-martialed for reckless endangerment of the fleet, assuming he survived the mission long enough to face charges. Henderson glanced at his fuel gauge and made a series of mental calculations that would determine the fate of Task Force 58. He had enough aviation gasoline for approximately 2 hours of combat flying, which meant he could pursue the Japanese formations to maximum intercept range and still return to the carrier with a minimal reserve. It would be close, too close for any rational pilot to attempt, but it was mathematically possible. The critical moment arrived when Henderson's squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel William Duke Mitchell, transmitted the standard defensive positioning orders that would keep Fighting Squadron 16 circling protectively above the Lexington until the Japanese attack materialized. All Hellcat pilots assume combat air patrol stations at Angels 20 maintain defensive umbrella until further notice. Henderson's thumb found the radio transmit button, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, he hesitated. Everything in his training, every regulation in the tactical manual, every instinct drilled into him by months of military discipline demanded that he acknowledge the order and comply without question. But the farm boy from Nebraska, who had learned to think for himself in his father's hardware store, couldn't ignore the mathematical certainty that defensive tactics would result in disaster. Henderson keyed his microphone and spoke the words that would either save the Pacific Fleet or end his naval career. "Duke, this is Bulldog. Request permission to pursue bogies at maximum range before they reach defensive perimeter." The radio silence that followed stretched for 20 seconds before Mitchell's angry voice crackled back. "Negative, Bulldog. Maintain assigned station. That's a direct order." Henderson looked down at the carrier deck far below, where he could see deck crews preparing damage control equipment and firefighting gear for the attack they knew was coming. He thought of the 2,000 sailors aboard the Lexington who were depending on his squadron for protection, and of the thousands more throughout Task Force 58 who would die if 400 Japanese aircraft reached their targets. The mathematics were inescapable. Conventional defense would fail, and unconventional attack was their only chance for survival. Henderson made the decision that would haunt and vindicate him for the rest of his life. "Duke, this is Bulldog. I'm breaking station to pursue the main attack force. If I'm wrong, you can have my wings when I get back." Before Mitchell could respond, Henderson pushed his throttle to full power and turned his Hellcat toward the western horizon, where 400 enemy aircraft were bearing down on the American fleet. Behind him, he could hear Mitchell's furious voice ordering him to return to formation. But Henderson had already switched to a different radio frequency and begun transmitting on the emergency channel used for coordinating large-scale attacks. What Henderson did next would revolutionize naval aviation tactics and earn him a place in military history, though he would never receive official recognition for his actions that day. Instead of simply pursuing the Japanese formations as a lone fighter, Henderson began broadcasting tactical coordinates and attack vectors to every American aircraft within radio range, effectively assuming command of an improvised strike force that had never trained together. All Hellcat and Corsair pilots, this is Bulldog on guard frequency. I have 400-plus bogies bearing 270 at 120 miles and closing. Form up on me for maximum range intercept." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Pilots from 6 different squadrons broke formation and joined Henderson's unauthorized pursuit, creating a strike force of 87 fighters that bore down on the Japanese formations like a thunderbolt from the clear sky. Henderson had gambled that American pilots would recognize the tactical necessity of aggressive interception even if their commanders could not, and his faith in their judgment proved correct. As the distance closed between the opposing forces, Henderson refined his tactics with the instinctive genius that had made him a natural pilot. Instead of attacking the Japanese formations head-on, which would allow enemy fighters to concentrate their defense, Henderson split his improvised force into multiple attack groups that struck from different angles simultaneously. The effect was devastating. Japanese pilots who had trained for conventional defensive engagements found themselves under attack from directions they had never anticipated. Their formations shattered before they could bring their numerical superiority to bear. Henderson's tactical innovation was to use the superior speed and firepower of American aircraft to create local superiority at multiple points of contact, effectively turning one large battle into dozens of smaller engagements where experience and training mattered more than numbers. The result was a slaughter that would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, though the pilots who lived through it would always remember it as the day that Bulldog Henderson saved the Pacific Fleet by breaking every rule in the book. The actual engagement began at 11:37 in the morning, Pacific War Time, when Henderson's lead elements made contact with the first wave of Japanese aircraft at a range of 93 miles from Task Force 58. Henderson had positioned his fighters to attack from out of the sun, using the brilliant Pacific light to mask their approach until they were within gun range of the enemy formations. The Japanese pilots, most of whom had never experienced combat against American fighters, were caught completely by surprise when 87 Hellcats and Corsairs materialized from the glare like avenging angels. Henderson's own combat report, filed quietly days later, described the opening moments of the engagement with characteristic understatement. Enemy formations were well organized but showed little tactical flexibility when attacked from multiple vectors simultaneously. Defensive response was inadequate to prevent penetration of fighter escort screen. What Henderson's dry language concealed was one of the most lopsided aerial victories in military history, as American fighters tore through Japanese formations with methodical precision. Henderson himself shot down 3 enemy aircraft in the first 5 minutes of combat, using his superior gunnery training and aircraft performance to devastating effect. Around him, the other American pilots were achieving similar results as Japanese formations disintegrated under the coordinated assault. The key to Henderson's tactical success was his recognition that numbers meant nothing if they couldn't be brought to bear effectively, and his multi-directional attack plan ensured that Japanese pilots were never able to concentrate their forces against any single threat. Instead, they found themselves fighting individually against better-trained opponents flying superior aircraft, a combination that proved universally fatal. By noon, the first wave of the Japanese attack had been virtually annihilated, with 135 enemy aircraft shot down for the loss of only 6 American fighters. But Henderson knew that 3 more waves were following behind the first, and his improvised force was running low on ammunition and fuel. The second wave of Japanese aircraft arrived exactly 43 minutes after the first, consisting of 107 dive bombers and torpedo planes escorted by 28 fighters. Henderson had used the brief respite to reorganize his remaining fighters and redistribute ammunition from aircraft that had expended their loads in the initial engagement. This second battle proved even more decisive than the first, as Japanese pilots arrived over the combat area to find the sky filled with debris from their comrades and American fighters that seemed to be everywhere at once. Henderson had learned from the first engagement that Japanese formations became completely ineffective once their command structure was disrupted, so he concentrated his attacks on the lead aircraft that were providing navigation and tactical control for the bomber formations. The result was catastrophic for the Japanese. Without their formation leaders, bomber pilots found themselves scattered across hundreds of square miles of empty ocean, with no clear route to their targets and no coordination for their attacks. Henderson's fighters picked them off individually, like hunters shooting ducks from a blind. The destruction was so complete that only 11 aircraft from the second wave survived to return to their carriers, and none of them had come within 50 miles of the American fleet. Henderson himself shot down 2 more enemy aircraft during this phase of the battle, bringing his personal total to 5 confirmed kills. But more importantly, his tactical innovation had proven that aggressive interception at maximum range could neutralize even overwhelming numerical superiority if properly executed. American losses during the second engagement were limited to 3 fighters, all of which were recovered by rescue boats after their pilots bailed out safely. Henderson was beginning to realize that his unauthorized gamble was paying dividends beyond anything he had imagined when he first broke formation to pursue the enemy. The third wave proved to be the most dangerous for Henderson personally, as Japanese commanders had finally recognized that their attacks were being systematically dismantled by American fighters operating far from their defensive positions. The 82 aircraft of the third wave included 36 fighters, whose sole mission was to destroy Henderson's interceptors and clear the way for the bombers that followed. Henderson found himself in the position of being specifically hunted by enemy pilots who had analyzed his tactics and developed countermeasures designed to exploit his aggressive strategy. The engagement began when Henderson's radar operator warned him that the incoming Japanese fighters were flying in a tight defensive formation that would be difficult to penetrate without suffering heavy losses. For the first time since breaking formation, Henderson hesitated. He had already achieved a level of success that exceeded his wildest expectations, destroying 2 complete waves of enemy aircraft with minimal losses to his own force. The prudent course would be to withdraw his remaining fighters back toward the fleet and allow the defensive umbrella to handle the third wave using conventional tactics. But Henderson could see on his plotting board that 46 Japanese bombers were following behind the fighter screen, and he knew that even a reduced attack force of that size could inflict serious damage on the carriers if it reached its targets. The farm boy from Nebraska, who had learned to finish every job he started, made the decision to press his attack despite the increased risk to his pilots. Henderson transmitted new tactical instructions that called for his fighters to accept higher losses in exchange for breaking up the bomber formations before they could organize for their attack runs. The battle that followed was the fiercest air combat of Henderson's career, with American and Japanese fighters locked in a swirling dogfight that stretched across 50 miles of Pacific sky. Henderson shot down 1 more enemy fighter before taking cannon fire from a Japanese Zero that shattered his canopy and wounded him in the left shoulder. But his tactical plan succeeded. The Japanese bomber formation was scattered and disorganized by the time it fought through the American fighter screen, and the surviving aircraft were unable to coordinate an effective attack on Task Force 58. Only 7 Japanese aircraft from the third wave returned to their carriers. The fourth and final wave of the Japanese attack reached the intercept area at 2:15 in the afternoon, just as Henderson's fuel gauges were approaching the point of no return for getting back to the Lexington. Henderson had only 31 operational fighters remaining from his original force of 87, but the Japanese fourth wave consisted of only 49 aircraft, evidence that the previous engagements had forced enemy commanders to commit their reserves prematurely. Henderson realized that this would be his last chance to complete the destruction of the Japanese carrier strike force. but it would require him to fight the engagement with barely enough fuel to return home. The wounded pilot from Nebraska made one final tactical decision that would cement his place in aviation history. Instead of conserving fuel for the return flight, Henderson ordered his remaining fighters to use maximum power settings to achieve the quickest possible interception of the fourth wave, gambling that a short, violent engagement would be more effective than a prolonged, fuel-conscious battle. The gamble paid off spectacularly. Henderson's fighters struck the Japanese formations with such speed and ferocity that the enemy pilots had no time to organize any coherent response. In 11 minutes of combat, American fighters shot down 37 of the 49 aircraft in the fourth wave, including Henderson's 6th and 7th personal victories. The surviving 12 Japanese aircraft turned and fled toward their carriers without even attempting to complete their mission, marking the end of the largest carrier-based air attack in Japanese naval history. Henderson's fuel gauge was showing dangerously low levels as he ordered his fighters to disengage and return to Task Force 58, but he had achieved something that no tactical manual had ever considered possible: the destruction of a 400 aircraft strike force by a numerically inferior defensive force that had suffered total losses of only 23 aircraft. The mathematics of the engagement were stunning. Henderson's unauthorized tactics had achieved a kill ratio of better than 17-1, the most lopsided aerial victory in the history of naval warfare. The flight back to Task Force 58 tested Henderson's piloting skills as severely as the combat had tested his tactical genius. With fuel running critically low and his wounded shoulder making it difficult to control the aircraft, Henderson nursed his damaged Hellcat across 90 miles of empty ocean while maintaining formation with the 28 other fighters that had survived the 4-hour engagement. Radio communications with the fleet revealed that Henderson's tactical gamble had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Task Force 58 had suffered no damage whatsoever from the massive Japanese attack, while enemy carriers had lost approximately 400 aircraft and most of their experienced aircrew. The strategic implications were immediately apparent to fleet commanders. Japanese carrier aviation had been effectively eliminated as a fighting force, and the path to the Japanese home islands lay open before the advancing American fleet. Henderson's fuel gauge was reading empty when the familiar silhouette of the USS Lexington appeared on the horizon, her deck crews already preparing to recover the returning fighters. The landing approach proved to be the most challenging flying of Henderson's career, as his damaged aircraft responded sluggishly to control inputs and his wounded shoulder sent waves of pain through his body every time he moved the stick. Henderson's Hellcat touched down on the Lexington's deck with less than 5 gallons of fuel remaining in its tanks, so little that the engine died as he taxied clear of the landing area. Deck crews who rushed to help him from the cockpit found Henderson slumped over his controls, weakened by blood loss and exhaustion, but conscious enough to ask about the status of his pilots. 28 of the 31 fighters that had attempted the return flight made it safely back to their carriers, while the 3 aircraft lost during the return had all suffered battle damage that made controlled flight impossible. The pilots of those 3 aircraft were recovered by rescue boats and returned to their ships with minor injuries. Henderson's tactical innovation had not only saved Task Force 58 from devastating attack, but had done so while maintaining an extraordinarily low loss rate among his own forces. The immediate aftermath of what would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was characterized by an awkward silence from fleet commanders who recognized that Henderson's unauthorized tactics had achieved a decisive victory while completely violating established doctrine. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 58, faced a command dilemma that had no precedent in naval history: how to discipline an officer who had disobeyed direct orders but whose disobedience had saved the fleet from potentially catastrophic losses. Henderson's squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, recommended court-martial proceedings for insubordination and reckless endangerment of assigned aircraft, but Admiral Mark Mitcher, the tactical air commander for the operation, quietly filed a report that praised Henderson's innovative approach to defensive fighter tactics and recommended immediate promotion and decoration. The bureaucratic battle over Henderson's fate continued for 6 weeks while Task Force 58 completed the conquest of the Mariana Islands and began preparing for the next phase of the advance toward Japan. During this period, Henderson continued flying combat missions with his squadron, but he was ordered to follow standard tactical procedures and avoid any unauthorized innovations in future engagements. The restraint chafed at Henderson, who could see numerous opportunities to improve upon the tactics that had proven so successful during the June 20th engagement. But the pilot from Nebraska had learned that military bureaucracy moves slowly even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of success. Henderson's vindication came not from official channels, but from the enemy themselves. Japanese after-action reports captured later in the war revealed that Admiral Toyota had specifically cited the unexpected aggressiveness of American fighters as the primary reason for the failure of Operation Ago. Japanese pilots who survived the engagement reported that American fighter tactics had been unlike anything they had encountered in previous battles, suggesting that new training methods or operational doctrines were being employed by carrier-based squadrons. Henderson's personal life during the months following the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot reflected the complex emotions that came with sudden fame and continued uncertainty about his military future. Letters from home revealed that news of the great air battle had reached Nebraska through heavily censored press reports that mentioned heroic actions by Navy pilots from the Midwest, but provided no names or specific details. Henderson's father wrote that the hardware store had become an unofficial gathering place for local residents who wanted to discuss their town's contribution to the war effort, though none of them knew that their local hero was facing possible court-martial for the very actions that had made him famous. Henderson's fiancée, Mary Ellen Crawford, a school teacher from the neighboring town of Lexington, wrote weekly letters that revealed her growing anxiety about his safety and her frustration with the military censorship that prevented her from learning any details about his combat experiences. Henderson found himself unable to describe the emotional toll of the June 20th engagement in his responses to her letters, partly because of security restrictions, but mostly because he struggled to put into words the mixture of pride and guilt that came from commanding men in life-or-death situations. 3 of his pilots had been shot down during the engagement, and though all had been rescued safely, Henderson carried the weight of responsibility for putting them in harm's way through his unauthorized tactical decisions. The young pilot, who had grown up believing that right and wrong were clearly defined concepts, found that combat leadership involved navigating moral complexities that no training manual had prepared him for. Henderson's reputation among the other pilots of Fighting Squadron 16 evolved during this period from grudging respect to something approaching reverence, as his tactical innovations began to be studied and emulated throughout the squadron. But Henderson himself remained troubled by the knowledge that his success had come through deliberate violation of orders and military discipline. The official resolution of Henderson's case came in September of 1944, when Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of Pacific Fleet forces, issued a directive that became known as the Henderson Doctrine within Navy aviation circles. Instead of court-martialing the pilot who had saved Task Force 58, Nimitz ordered a complete revision of defensive fighter tactics based on Henderson's innovations during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The new tactical manual specifically authorized aggressive interception at maximum range when facing overwhelming numerical odds, and it included detailed procedures for coordinating multi-squadron attacks against large enemy formations. Henderson was promoted to full commander and assigned to the staff of the Navy's Tactical Development Center, where he would spend the remainder of the war developing and refining the combat doctrines that grew out of his unauthorized experiment over the Philippine Sea. The promotion came with a personal letter from Admiral Nimitz that praised Henderson's initiative and tactical genius, while noting that future innovations should be developed through proper channels rather than implemented during actual combat operations. Henderson understood that he was being both rewarded and warned. His tactical breakthrough had been accepted and institutionalized, but any future unauthorized actions would result in severe consequences. The farm boy from Nebraska had learned that sometimes the military rewarded success even when that success came through violation of regulations, but such rewards were rare and never guaranteed. Henderson's new assignment allowed him to work with test pilots and tactical analysts to refine the aggressive fighter tactics that had proven so effective against Japanese formations, ensuring that future American pilots would have the benefit of proper training in methods that Henderson had improvised under combat conditions. The mathematical principles underlying Henderson's tactical innovation became the foundation for fighter doctrine that would be used not only for the remainder of World War II, but also during the conflicts in Korea and Vietnam. Henderson's post-war career reflected the quiet satisfaction of a man who had changed history without seeking fame or recognition for his contributions. He left active duty in 1946 and returned to Nebraska, where he used his military experience and the GI Bill to study aeronautical engineering at the University of Nebraska. After graduation, Henderson accepted a position with Boeing Aircraft Company, where he spent the next 30 years designing and testing military aircraft that incorporated the tactical lessons learned during his combat experience in the Pacific. Henderson married Mary Ellen Crawford in 1947, and they raised 3 children in a modest home in Seattle, Washington, where Henderson commuted daily to the Boeing plant and spent his weekends teaching his sons to repair engines in a garage workshop that reminded him of his father's hardware store. The former naval aviator seldom spoke about his wartime experiences, even to his family, but he maintained correspondence with many of the pilots who had followed him into combat during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Annual reunions of Fighting Squadron 16 became increasingly important to Henderson as he aged, providing an opportunity to reconnect with men who understood the unique bonds forged by shared combat experiences. Henderson's children learned about their father's wartime heroics not from him, but from other pilots who attended these reunions, men who spoke with quiet reverence about the day that Bulldog Henderson had saved the Pacific Fleet by refusing to follow orders. Henderson's response to such praise was always the same. He had simply done what any pilot would have done when faced with the mathematical certainty that conventional tactics would fail. The humility was genuine, reflecting Henderson's belief that his tactical innovations had been obvious applications of common sense rather than strokes of genius. But the pilots who had flown with him knew better, understanding that Henderson's combination of technical expertise, tactical insight, and moral courage was extraordinarily rare. The broader historical impact of Henderson's unauthorized tactical experiment became clear only decades after the war, when declassified Japanese records revealed the full extent of damage inflicted on enemy carrier aviation during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Imperial Japanese Navy losses on June 20, 1944, included 373 aircraft and approximately 200 experienced aircrew, representing nearly 70% of Japan's remaining carrier-based striking power. The psychological impact on Japanese naval commanders was even more devastating than the material losses, as the ease with which American fighters had decimated their carefully planned attack shattered confidence in the tactical doctrines that had guided Japanese naval aviation since Pearl Harbor. Admiral Toyoda's post-battle assessment, discovered in captured documents after Japan's surrender, specifically cited the unexpected effectiveness of American defensive tactics as evidence that the naval balance in the Pacific had shifted decisively in favor of the United States. Japanese carrier forces never again attempted a major offensive operation after the failure of Operation Ago, effectively conceding control of Pacific skies to American aviation for the remainder of the war. Henderson's tactical innovation had achieved strategic results far beyond anything he had intended when he first broke formation to pursue the enemy attack force. Military historians would later identify June 20, 1944, as the date when Japanese naval aviation ceased to exist as an effective fighting force, marking the beginning of the final phase of the Pacific War. The mathematical principles underlying Henderson's success, using superior technology and training to achieve local superiority despite overall numerical disadvantage, would become fundamental concepts in modern air combat doctrine, influencing fighter tactics through the jet age and into the era of computer-controlled warfare. Henderson's quiet death from a heart attack in 1978 brought an unexpected outpouring of recognition from military aviation communities around the world. His funeral in Seattle was attended by more than 300 former military pilots, including several retired admirals who had served under his command during the war. The eulogy delivered by Admiral William "Bulldog" Halsey, Jr. Poitras, the son of Henderson's wartime commander, described the Nebraska farm boy as a pilot's pilot who understood that sometimes courage means breaking the rules when following them would result in disaster. The Navy Department's official statement on Henderson's death credited him with revolutionary contributions to fighter tactics that enhanced the combat effectiveness of carrier aviation for more than 3 decades. But perhaps the most meaningful tribute came from the Japanese Naval Aviation Museum in Tokyo, which installed a permanent exhibit describing the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot as a demonstration of tactical innovation that transformed modern air combat. The exhibit specifically noted that Henderson's aggressive interception doctrine had become the standard against which all subsequent fighter tactics were measured, and it praised his warrior's intuition that recognized opportunity within crisis. Henderson would have been amused by the international recognition, given his lifelong belief that he had simply applied common sense to an obvious tactical problem. The farm boy who had learned to think for himself in his father's hardware store had never fully understood that his ability to see mathematical relationships in 3-dimensional combat geometry was a rare gift rather than a common skill. Henderson's legacy lived on not only in the tactical manuals that bore his influence, but also in the hundreds of pilots he had trained during his post-war career at Boeing, men and women who carried his pragmatic approach to problem-solving into the aerospace industry and the military services. The final assessment of Henderson's contribution to military history must account for both the immediate tactical success of his unauthorized actions and the long-term strategic implications of his innovative approach to air combat. The numbers alone tell a compelling story. On June 20, 1944, Henderson's 87 fighters destroyed approximately 400 enemy aircraft while suffering losses of only 23 American planes, achieving a kill ratio that had never been equaled before or since in large-scale air combat. But beyond the statistics lies the more important question of whether Henderson's willingness to violate direct orders represented admirable initiative or dangerous insubordination. The answer depends partly on results. Henderson succeeded spectacularly, validating his tactical judgment, but it also raises fundamental questions about military discipline and command authority that remain relevant today. Henderson himself never claimed that his actions during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot represented anything more than an obvious response to an impossible tactical situation, and he consistently maintained that any competent pilot would have reached the same conclusions when faced with the mathematical certainties of the developing engagement. But the historical record suggests that Henderson possessed a rare combination of technical expertise, tactical insight, and moral courage that enabled him to recognize opportunities that eluded his contemporaries. The farm boy from Nebraska who had learned to fix engines before he could drive them brought to naval aviation a practical understanding of mechanical systems and human limitations that proved invaluable in the crucible of combat. Henderson's story reminds us that sometimes the most important victories are won not by following established procedures, but by having the courage to trust our own judgment when conventional wisdom points toward disaster. The mathematics of June 20th, 1944, demonstrated that one man's willingness to take responsibility for an unauthorized decision could change the course of history, saving thousands of lives and altering the strategic balance of the Pacific War. Whether Henderson's legacy represents the triumph of individual initiative over bureaucratic inflexibility or the dangerous precedent of military insubordination depends on each reader's judgment about the proper balance between obedience and conscience in times of crisis. What cannot be disputed is that Henderson's actions that morning over the Philippine Sea demonstrated the profound impact that one person's moral courage can have when applied with technical competence and tactical genius. Would you have broken the order to pursue 400 enemy aircraft at maximum range, risking court-martial and possible death to implement an untested tactical doctrine? Comment below and share this story so others remember what real courage looks like when everything depends on a single decision made in the heat of battle.